Cornils, a social work student, a social work major actually, and an honors student as well. Within the past year, I guess, I've developed a passion for advocating for individuals who don't have the barest of necessities. And some people forget that there are a lot of people who don't live without the barest of necessities, like housing. When we think of necessities that you need to live, it's usually food, clothes, water, and a place to live. However, some people still in this day and age aren't allowed or don't have the opportunity to have a place to live. And that is where I am very interested in the social work field. One of the reasons that drove me to work towards this, like James and Paul mentioned, was that when I was in high school, because I went to public school and I wanted to get confirmed, I had to go through like religion classes in order to get confirmed. And one of my religion teachers, Mark Reeve, who you'll see in a video in a little while, he tried opening up a homeless shelter in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, which is right next door to Two Rivers, where I am from. And I followed that story closely because there is a need in Manitowoc, even though people don't quite understand that, because it is a smaller city, not a big metropolis, where you see homeless people living on the streets and so forth. So because it's kind of an invisible problem, people don't usually see the homeless because they live in big parks and stuff like that, which Mark has told me about. That is why it hasn't gotten some support, and I'll go into that as well later. Some of you, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of NIMBYism. I have gotten some questions. That stands for not in my backyard. And that is an idea that some people hold, and that was the lead argument against these homeless shelters opening. And I will go into that further, also a little further into my presentation. According to ReadyWisconsin.gov, between January 31st and February 2nd, 2012, and 2013, I mean, parts of Wisconsin had from a foot of snow to 33 inches of snow, with gusts of wind between 40 and 65 miles an hour. I remember having to walk to class in that and bundling up, and it was terrible. I hated walking, I hated shoveling. I'm sure other people hated snowblowing and driving in it, but could you imagine living in that type of circumstance? And the reality is that some people actually do, and that is one of the reasons why I have such an interest in homelessness. While talking about homelessness, we must understand who experiences homelessness. According to Janssen, 22% of all sheltered homeless people struggle with severe mental illness. Now, say if all of you were single, living by yourself, barely making rent, say you had a lower income job and you got laid off from this job or fired, or the business just closed, how many of you, by show of hands, think that you would have some type of support in line that way you could go crash on someone's couch? Now, when you struggle with a severe mental illness, the connections that people have get strained because of the illness. And it is very tough for people to maintain these relationships, and often people who struggle with severe mental illness do not have the same connections and relationships that we have. According to Jones, there was a study by Stoner from 1999. He states that from 15 to 39% of the nation's homeless are former foster youth. There are many reasons why former foster youth have such a problem with homelessness. The biggest reason is because when on their 18th birthday, they then graduate from the state's supervision. The state no longer has to provide them with housing or support. So basically, as an 18-year-old, that was me fresh out of college, I would have to find a place to live, a source of income where I could sustain a place to live. And that would be very difficult. And people in foster youth often leave without a high school diploma, which then leads to insecure and low-wage jobs. Mental health and substance abuse issues often may arise from this. It could be a cause. And the biggest reason why the former foster youth struggle with homelessness so much is just because of a lack of dependable income, which is best most to blame for their homelessness. And it's totally understandable. As an 18-year-old, you're technically an adult, but you're still not at the level where you can support yourself. According to nationalhomeless.org, 40% of homeless men are veterans. Veterans often have a tough time with finding housing because when they come back from battle, they often struggle with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, which makes it tough for them to adapt back into regular society. Things aren't as easy as they are as when they went overseas to fight. And when they come back, they are often having struggles with finding a place to live, and too often become homeless. How many people actually use homeless shelters? A 2007 study of 100 communities by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development showed that 1.5 million people used emergency or transitional shelters, and 70% of these people were individuals, which is very important, remember that statistic, compared to only 30% of people using shelters being families or being a couple. But in Wisconsin, we often don't realize our problems with homelessness. A study done in 2009-2010 by the Wisconsin Department of Commerce shows homelessness statistics in Wisconsin. It states that 17,007 people used emergency shelters in 2010. That is taking my hometown of Two Rivers, having 5,000 people move into it, and then suddenly have no place to live and need to use emergency shelters. 25% of these people were under the age of 18. 8.31% of these people were veterans. 41% of the people using emergency shelters had a disability. A majority of them were single, as you can see in this graph, and from the 70%, I said it in the last slide, and 59% of them were male. So a majority of the people who need or utilize emergency shelters are single men, and often they're the ones who do not have services, which I will go into later as well. But who offers services to the homeless? Usually they're offered by either church groups or other private nonprofit organizations. And often they'll collaborate where, say, a church owns a building, say an abandoned school, and then a private nonprofit organization uses that as a shelter. And there are three major types of housing for the homeless. The first type is emergency shelters, which for example is the Oshkosh day-by-day warming shelter, which I will tell you more about in a little while. Transitional housing, which is more than an emergency shelter, but it is not really a stable place of living. And the third is permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is that sometimes they offer job training and mental health programs. They're often ran by housing authorities, and Oshkosh has an Oshkosh Housing Authority. Well, I will actually be interning in the fall, and they provide low-income housing on Main Street. There's a 10-story building filled with, it's basically a big high-rise apartment, and people who have disabilities and aren't able to work live there. Other people are just low income. They can fill out applications for vouchers, such as Section 8 housing, and the rent is often very minimum or totally subsidized. Some of the services that are offered in our area is the Oshkosh day-by-day warming shelter, which is an emergency shelter, the emergency shelter of the Fox Valley in Appleton, the new community shelter in Green Bay, the Prodigal Son Project in Manitowoc County, which is a really interesting one actually. It's ran by a couple, just two people, and they're very faith-based, and they have taken in about 6 to 10 men usually at a time. And the husband in this relationship, he teaches them certain skills like home maintenance and other construction-like things so that when they leave this program, they have certain tangible skills so they can go find a job and escape homelessness. But here are some attempts to serve the homeless. And I say attempts because these are only shelters that attempted to get open and they never were. Mostly because of the reason of NIMBYism, which I'll get into now. Defined by Deere and found in Abraham and Maney, NIMBYism is defined as protectionist attitudes and exclusionary opposition tactics adopted by community groups facing an unwelcome development in their neighborhood. And this doesn't only have to do with homeless shelters. Other examples of NIMBYism are, say, people who don't want wind towers near their house, or even people who are just afraid of a few businesses moving near their neighborhood because of a rise of traffic. Some of the NIMBY concerns about homeless shelters are safety, one for the safety of their family living there, or the safety of their property as well. And another NIMBY concern that has been prevalent in the two cases I'll go into was the argument of lowered property values. Now say if you owned a house in a residential neighborhood and a homeless shelter moved in, how many would think that your property value would decrease by about 10%? By show of hands. Okay. A 2007 study by the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy at New York University showed that the values of properties within 500 feet of supportive housing show steady growth, and properties from 500 to 1,000 feet away show initial decline and then steady growth. So the argument that I don't want a homeless shelter near my house because, well, my property value will go down, and if I try to sell my house, I won't get as much back for it as I thought I would when I initially bought the house. That argument proves untrue. It could be true in some certain cases in some certain cities, but this study shows that's not always true. And within the case of the two shelters that I just told you about, the Haven and the Southern Door Community Church, there was a presence of cognitive dissonance among the people who did not want the shelter to open. Cognitive dissonance theory is a prominent theory used in social work practice, and it basically allows people to justify thoughts that usually would go against their own ethics or morals. And an example of that, as I'll show you now, is that I'm going to talk to you about the case of the Haven in Manitowoc, which I mentioned before. Manitowoc has a mayor-council form of government, which is the one that Paul was mentioning in Green Bay. It's where each city council member, they have a ward or a district, and then they represent that district. And in Manitowoc, where this happens, this allows each city council member that it seems more that it's more piece by piece by piece by piece instead of one city council representing the whole city. And that played a factor, I believe, into why the shelter ultimately got denied. The cognition between both the city council and the residents of the neighborhoods and of Manitowoc, they both thought that they recognized the need for a shelter. Not once in the city council meetings I observed did anyone say that, well, there really isn't a homelessness problem. It was pointed out pretty evidently, and everybody knew that there was a homelessness problem in Manitowoc and Manitowoc County. And I was going to how the cognitive dissonance plays in. First, in the city council. The event took place when there was a proposed shelter in Manitowoc, which landed in one city council member's ward. And then their dissonance was that, well, I recognize the need for the shelter, I don't want to upset my residents. Because as a politician, your goals are to not upset the people who you represent, otherwise you'll have a pretty short life as a politician. So because they didn't want to upset the residents, that was where the dissonance came in, and usually where they don't. That's where they didn't agree with what they thought was the need of the shelter being, or the need for a homeless shelter being opened. And because this went against what they knew, that they knew that maybe a shelter should have been open and there's a need and the city could benefit, the way they justified their decision of voting down the shelter was they said that they can't ignore the fear of the residents. Even though these residents are fearful of the shelter being open because of their NIMBY beliefs, they can't ignore the fears of this, even if they prove to be impractical, because basically quoting one city council member said that it's not our job up here to rationalize the fears of our constituents. And because the one city council member where the shelter would have landed voted down, and most of the city council members also basically said that I wouldn't feel right, I wouldn't vote for it if this was in my district, so ethically I can't vote for it in someone else's district. And on part of the residents, the event took place when there was a proposed shelter, which was the Haven in their neighborhood. And they both agreed also that they recognized the need for a homeless shelter. However, their dissonance was that I want the shelter, but it's not the right location. I don't want it near my house. I don't want it within a couple blocks of where my kids play. And the way they justified this, because most of the people who presented NIMBY attitudes, they said how, oh, well, I've helped homeless people in the past, or my cousin was homeless, and I gave him a couch to sleep on. And they also hold a lot of Christian beliefs, too, in this area. And so they needed to justify their actions of why they wouldn't want to support the homeless population in Manitowoc. And the way they justified it was saying that it would lower our property values, and the big one, endangered my family. Whenever anyone says anything, they never would compromise the safety of their family for anything, no matter what. Now I will actually show you some news clips of how effective NIMBYism can be. The first video I'm going to show you is of a city council meeting regarding the potential opening of the Haven. This was prior to the city council meeting I'm telling you about where it was turned down. They were just proposing to the building commission actually because they needed a conditional use permit to open and run as a homeless facility. And so I will show you this video right now talking about this. And pay attention to the nonverbals in this video, such as how do you think these people feel just by the way they're sitting or standing about the shelter.
It has been a packed house inside Manitowoc City Council chambers tonight as a proposed homeless shelter for men is being discussed. Good evening, everyone. After more than a couple of hours of public discussion that just ended a few minutes ago, the city's plan commission still faced with deciding whether to grant the shelter a conditional use permit.
Now, as you just saw, the meeting drew in a substantial crowd with people on both sides of the issue. The proposed shelter would be located on the corner of South 29th Street and Meadow Lane. Our Ben Krumholtz brings us more in this Fox 11 follow-up.
Manitowoc's Plan Commission meetings typically don't meet in the city's council chambers.
Meadow Lane, South 29.
But this meeting was an exception, as a capacity crowd wanted to hear about The Haven, a proposed homeless shelter for men.
This is one of the main gathering areas.
Mark LaGrieve has been helping organize the men's homeless shelter for the past 18 months.
This is a long time thing. This has been a long time coming. It should have been done 10 years ago.
Manitowoc County does have the Hope House for the homeless, but they don't take in single men. LaGrieve says there are about 30 homeless single men in the county. The Haven hopes to house up to 20 in this building. The plan is why so many people showed up at the Plan Commission meeting. At one point, a Manitowoc fire official stopped the meeting to reorganize people to meet the room's fire code.
A lot of what I was going to say had already been said.
People on both sides of the shelter plan took turns voicing their opinions.
To be intellectually honest about this with yourself, ask if this is the type of situation you want next door to your place of work or in your backyard or walking the streets with your children.
I would urge that we look within ourselves and be helpful to those that need the help.
It is possible for them to stay there.
LaGrieve says no matter what the city decides, the Haven still needs more donations and building repairs before it would open. In Manitowoc, Ben Krumholtz, Fox 11 News.
Now, we are learning just moments ago the Plan Commission did go ahead and give the permit that would eventually open this facility. But of course, now this issue needs to go before the full city council, so that's the next step. LaGrieve says that two banks are financing the purchase of the South 29th Street building, which would eventually be the Haven. It was recently listed for sale at $100,000.
It was like $100-something thousand. Sorry. But the sad part is that they were so close to being open. The Plan Building Commission had awarded them the actual permit, but then the city council meeting came up and the NIMBYism just exploded, basically. Grew and got so much stronger that it basically just scared the city council into not opening the shelter. Now remember the resistance, or what examples of resistance did you guys see in that video?
Crossed arms.
What's that?
Crossed arms.
Yeah, definitely. And did you guys hear any examples of NIMBYism at all? Someone?
Yeah. He said, not in my backyard. Not the kind of place I want in my backyard.
Yeah, and one of the main arguments that the city council said that most shelters are opened in, not in residential areas, but in like downtowns, basically, so it's not near houses. This guy even said, you want this near your place of work also. So there basically was no chance for the shelter to be open because the community did not support it at all. And here is a video clip regarding the one in Union, Wisconsin, which was in Door County, the Southern Door Community Church. This is the news clip regarding the decision on that shelter as well.
County currently does not have a homeless shelter.
A local church is hoping to change that by turning some of its worship space into rooms for families in need. Southern Door Community Church in the town of Union proposed the idea, but some neighbors are saying, not in my backyard. Tonight we take a closer look at the plans, the issue of homelessness on the peninsula, and what can make or break the project. Homelessness may not seem to be an issue in Door County, but according to the experts, it's bigger than you think. According to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, 7% of all homeless people live in a rural community.
And so I kind of did the math, and of the 28,000 that we have living here year-round, 7% is almost 2,000 people.
Banal Timrick says while the problem may not be as visible on the peninsula as in larger cities, it does exist.
We've had clients here up in Door County that have been fleeing domestic related situations, that have lived in their vehicles and their cars during the summertime.
We have to have this permit before we go any further.
At Southern Door Community Church in the town of Union, Pastor Paul Peterson and his congregation have a plan to help the homeless in Door County, but it still needs town board approval.
As a congregation, we looked at this facility, and it's paid for, and it's pretty large for a group of 40 people to be used once a week. And so the question was, what more can we do?
Peterson is proposing remodeling the area where services are held so the church can house a privately funded homeless shelter. It would have 5 sleeping rooms, plus a couple of common areas. Church members want to model the shelter after Freedom House in Green Bay through a 90-day program that would help families find work and a roof over their heads.
Surround them with people who care about them. Help them learn some skills. Help them learn some things about finances, about nutrition, about family.
But what about the proposed shelter's rural location halfway between Green Bay and Sturgeon Bay? How would kids get to school and parents to work?
There'll have to be some travel. They'll have to be transporting the moms to their jobs and things. But that's all accounted for in our budgeting.
Peterson says he's absolutely convinced there are more people in the township that support the initiative than oppose it.
Everyone has a reason.
But Town Chair Cletus Fontaine tells Fox 11 differently.
The only support that I've received has been from calls from Green Bay, Sturgeon Bay, Algoma, Floresville. I've received none positive from the municipality.
Fontaine says declining property values and appropriateness for the area are among the biggest concerns.
It's just not the place for it.
But safety is also on some people's minds.
If the people go outside, what are they going to do? Roam around? You know, maybe they would come here. You never know.
Peterson says neighbors should not be concerned.
Everyone coming into the program will be thoroughly background checked, criminal screening.
Ultimately, the go-ahead for the shelter is in the hands of the town's 3 board members. Now, Wednesday, the Uniontown Board is scheduled to meet and may vote on whether to issue a conditional use permit to the church for the shelter.
The Union shelter also was ultimately turned down because it was such a small town. They laid a town board, which full of 3 members, and it was basically a unanimous vote that no, they wouldn't open the shelter. Did anyone catch the cognitive dissonance basically in the end with the lady with the ashes on her forehead?
They're going to be roaming around.
Yeah, come visit you when you're home also.
Well, she obviously had also, and that's Ash Wednesday, Catholic Church.
Yeah.
She's, recognizing or identifying herself as a person of faith. If she would ask, what would Jesus do, perhaps the answer would have been different.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's basically what I was thinking also. So what are the consequences of NIMBYism? Obviously, one of the biggest consequences of NIMBYism is that people just won't receive any homeless services. So what happens to homeless people when they don't have any services available to them? A statistic out of Shipley and Templemeyer stated that in 2008, 423 of approximately 11,000 inmates in Harris County or Houston, Texas, were homeless and had some form of mental illness. Well, so this isn't necessarily saying that there weren't services available, but if there were services available, I think that the number of 423 would be lowered. And the homeless too often need to commit crimes to either have a place to live or also receive services for, say, their mental illness. And as a majority of us in here are either working for social service or social work, what effect would the availability of shelters and social workers within a shelter have on the crime rate? Personally, I think that the crime rate would end up being lower if there were more services for homeless people. Some more consequences of NIMBYism is that, from the examples I've showed you, is that it has the ability to help community activism. In Manitowoc and Union, there was no chance for these shelters to be opened at all. However, in places like Oshkosh and Green Bay and Appleton, homeless shelters are thriving. And the we want it, but not here mentality, which feeds into NIMBYism also, leads to consequences of NIMBYism. How long will people like the pastor at the church or Mark LeGrieve, want to attempt to help the homeless just to be denied, a certain amount of fatigue must set in when you try so hard, spend so many hours, but then ultimately just get denied because your shelter is just not the right place. However, the most severe consequence of NIMBYism is that many homeless people went through another Wisconsin winter, which was a long one, without any type of shelter. As social workers, which most of us are in this room, we have to acknowledge that we have a commitment to be actively engaged in community activism. The National Association for Social Workers Code of Ethics, which all social workers must obey to, well, work for basically and follow, that they must acknowledge the value of service. We are here to serve individuals, but also our communities to work for the best in society. Standard 6.04 states that we must engage in social and political action. And a week ago, we actually went down to Madison and did some of this. We went down and lobbied to our state legislators, and we took political action. Even though it wasn't on this homelessness issue, we still did that. Standard 6.01 quotes from social welfare. Social workers should promote the general welfare of society from local to global levels. So even voicing your opinion at a city council meeting would be working towards social welfare because your voice is going to be heard on a local level. Now, I have been talking negatively about the services for homelessness in Wisconsin, but for communities who are failing to support and give homeless services, we must look at successful communities. And it does not take more than about a mile down High Avenue to the Oshkosh Day by Day warming shelter. I interviewed with Angie McCarthy, and she is the executive director of the Oshkosh Day by Day warming shelter. And they offered services last season from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. from mid-October to mid-April. However, next year, they're going to be expanding their hours to opening their doors at 6 p.m. and staying open until 8 a.m. At first, well, they take in people who are denied at other Oshkosh shelters, such as Father Cars. They will take in people who have criminal backgrounds or are also drug users and alcohol users as well.